Okay. Thank you for the introduction and thank you all for being here. I didn't realize I was going to be the first one of the semester, so it's a lot of pressure, but I'll do my best. Actually very excited to talk about my research and the project that I did last summer for my field practicum in the Master of Sustainable Development with the help of my committee members, Bob, John Dane, and Stephen Purse. I can use the keyboard too, right? Okay, so first I'm gonna give you a little bit of context, and the reason I became passionate about the Amazon was because of its environmental importance. Before I learned about all the social aspects of it, it has, as we all have heard, it has a lot of carbon stocks, which is very important for climate change mitigation or exacerbation, depending on what happens. And it also has a huge biodiversity, very recognized for that. So that always had my attention about the Amazon. And then when I started looking more about the Brazilian Amazon, I realized that protected areas are a really large part of it, and half of those are indigenous territories. The other half are conservation units. And then I also found that around indigenous territories, and it's TIs for its initials in Portuguese, but around those, there's a lot of deforestation going on. So they're freezing a lot of dirt, but they're also acting as a barrier against deforestation. And the indigenous territories are actually a constitutional right granted by the Constitution of 1988. So it grants indigenous people the possession and the use of those natural resources, all of the resources contained within those territories. And so here's a map. It's a little bit outdated. It's up to 2016, but it basically shows the protected areas in green, and then all the red is deforestation. So you can see that the protected areas are really acting as that barrier that I mentioned. And according to this report, only 2% of the deforestation was occurring within indigenous lands. So it's really, they're doing a really good job at protecting. And here's a picture that maybe you have seen something similar where it shows like that deforestation, you can see the fields and then the forest and that contrast. But on going to Brazil, it was very impressive to see it in person and just seeing, as soon as we left the city, it was just crops of different types, mostly monocultures. And you can just see behind any field that you see, there's the forest like behind it. So you can really see it as like the frontier being expanded into the forest. And sometimes there was like patches of forest between the fields. And you saw just like the huge biodiversity in those little patches of forest and then monoculture. It was just a very impressive contrast in a very sad way. And so as we saw there, they are doing a good job at keeping deforestation out, but they also face a lot of other threats. So logging is one of them, land grabbing and mining. So that leads to a lot of degradation in the territories, and they're usually linked to other illegal activities like corruption, fraud, drugs, and all of these things work against indigenous people, and they impose a lot of violence against them. So during Bolsonaro's presidency, there were 800 murders of indigenous people, which is really a sad reality for them. And this was just during those 4 years, and it often is linked to land conflict. And a lot of these threats are kind of driven by, or largely driven by, economic interests. So in Brazil, 29% of the GDP comes from the agricultural input sector. So there's this huge economic actors that want to go into indigenous lands and use those resources. And because of this, there's also a lot of political influence. So in Bolsonaro's presidency, we saw like not only did he speak against indigenous people, leading to more invasions, but he also promoted policies that threatened those territories. Like he transferred the power to recognize indigenous lands to the Ministry of Agriculture. So obviously, the Ministry of Agriculture is gonna want to delay those demarcations, and the land demarcations are a very important process for them to have their rights recognized. And as a response to these threats, the indigenous movement has really been showing up, especially the youth. They have been driving this movement. They have organizations at the local, state, regional, and national level. So a lot of organizations going on. And they're mobilizing not only for indigenous rights, but also for a lot of other social issues that are very important. And they're really making the voice of indigenous people heard across the country and internationally. And there's also women taking a major role in politics. So we have, they recently Lula created the first Ministry for Indigenous People. and the head of that is a woman, Sonia Guajajara. And then also for FUNAI, which is the Agency for Indigenous People in Brazil, the president is also a woman. So they're indigenous women. So they're really taking a step and they're really taking that lead, which is very cool. And they have emerged as guardians of the forest. They're taking a lot of initiatives in protecting the forest and really cool strategies. And it's the reason why my research is focused on this. Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, so they're taking a lot of initiatives, and I wanted to document what their experiences are and what has worked well for them. And I did this with the host organization Canindé. They have worked with indigenous people for over 30 years, and they've done it in agricultural development, ethno mapping, territorial protection is one of the big ones as well, but many different topics that seek to address their needs. They're based in Portobello, Honduras, so I was there with them last summer. And if you guys haven't seen this documentary on Nat Geo, it's a very cool documentary. And Canindé were actually the ones that worked with Nat Geo to create it, and it was indigenous people recording within the territories. It was a really, really cool collaboration. And they also made sure to include the other perspective. So the perspective of people who are invading, what are the social problems behind that need? So it was very cool to hear their perspective on on the territory. I saw them like celebrities. I was very excited to work with them. And they actually recently won the international Emmy for this show. So if you guys, or this documentary, if you guys haven't seen it, you guys should watch it. It is really cool. And just a map to show you where I was in Brazil. So Rondônia is that state in green up there. And then here on this map, you can see that large indigenous territory in the middle is Uruguay, is one of the one that this documentary is based on, and is one of the groups that they work most closely with. It's a huge, huge territory. So it has a lot of threats and a lot of needs. And then you can see Portobello farther north as well. And this is my framework for the research project. So I already discussed a lot of the threats that are driving territorial protection at the local, regional, and national levels. But territorial protection is not only responding to these threats, they're also seeking to promote the indigenous rights. And this can also be seen at the local level, so they can have their stewardship and practice buen vivir, so they have that relationship with the land and they can live better. And then that also leads to forest conservation, biodiversity conservation, and at the more global level, climate change mitigation as well. And so we can see in territorial protection, there are three main actors that work together: indigenous people, NGOs, and government agencies. And in that collaboration, they have this set of knowledge, which is what I wanted to capture with my practicum. And I wanted to document this for them to have it as an experience, a record of their own experience, a process of learning also while they reflected upon their own experiences, and also so they can share it with other communities who are wanting to learn about this. And so I conducted 18 semi-structured interviews with those three groups of people. And I used appreciative inquiry, which is an approach that is more focused on the positives. So we often ask questions about the problems, and we already know there's a lot of problems which are very real, but it's also important to focus on the strengths, what's working well, what motivates, so you can take that and use it to take the next steps. So that's why I picked that approach. And I used it to do a SWOT analysis. So maybe many of you have heard the SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the SWOT is similar, but it's also a little more positive. So it fits better with appreciative inquiry. And I did a kind of a modified stakeholder analysis. So I originally had these categories for it, which are the more usual ones, and they're usually for like organizations and businesses, but that didn't really fit with my set of people that I was working with. So I modified them a little bit, and these are the ones that I ended up with. And then there are also some other categories that were just emerging from the data. So as you can see, challenges were also discussed because they are very, very much real. And some of my results. So the first thing is I found that there are three main components of territorial protection. So first you have monitoring, which is done initially by indigenous communicators. And it's where they remotely just check on the status of the land. They can check deforestation rates, where there's burning, where there's threats coming in. And if there's any threat that needs to be addressed, then they can start planning with the leaders. And they go into the next step, which is patrolling, which is done mostly by indigenous environmental agents. And that is the step where they do expeditions into the forest. So they actually walk through the forest for several days or weeks, and then they go to the point of invasion, and they're collecting data all the while. From there, they can create a report that then they take to the law enforcement agencies. So one of the main things to take from here is that you can see that there's various indigenous actors taking initiative in this, but they're usually working with NGOs and FUNAI, which, like I said, is the Indigenous People Agency. So they work together throughout monitoring and patrolling, but when it comes to law enforcement, they cannot address the invasion. They cannot arrest someone or confiscate the materials. They need the law enforcement agencies to do that part. And these are the different law enforcement agencies that there are in Brazil for this type of thing. And there are two main things that they determine how much they help address invasions. The first one is whether they operate continuously, and the second one is whether they have police power to actually arrest someone for environmental crime. So we saw that FUNAI does operate continuously with them. They're always with them, but they only have administrative police power, so they cannot arrest someone. The National Forest can also operate continuously, but it's more for like personal security, so they cannot arrest someone for environmental crime. And then the other ones, they don't operate continuously, so when they call them, there's a high demand, they have limited resources, so they can't respond quickly to it. And the last one, environmental police, meets both of the requirements, operate continuously, law enforcement power. But there's this limitation where the president has to sign a provisional measure at the beginning of the year for the environmental police to work with FUNAI and get paid basically. And so as of August, when I did my last interview, the person that I interviewed and talked about it said that Lula hadn't signed it as of August, which is like 8 months of the year. I don't know if they ended up signing it. I need to do more research, but it's another limitation that can really limit the operation of these agencies. And so I found two main things that have really made it so that territorial protection is more effective and just so much better. And the first one is technology. So we saw those indigenous actors taking that space in monitoring and patrolling activities. So the first one is indigenous communicator, and as I mentioned, they do that work with using drones, GIS, different technologies like that. But they also play a really important role in advocacy in the indigenous movements. So bringing those stories out to the non-indigenous world, making their voices heard, and they do that a lot through photography, video, social media. And then we also have the indigenous environmental agents, and these are trained for territorial protection, and they learn how to use different apps on their phone, on the tablet, how to track different data about the invasions and get a really good idea of what's going on in the territory. So with all this information, they actually have their own databases that they can use to plan better, to just manage their territory in a more informed way and do better protection. And the second thing that has really improved territorial protection is this capacity building that NGOs and government agencies do with indigenous people. So the first one, technology, as I mentioned, is very important. And they're really using the capacity that young people already have with phones. So indigenous people even in the most remote areas are already using phones, using tablets. So they're really using their existing knowledge to build upon it and to use it for their benefit, for territorial protection specifically. And this is where a lot of the workshops for communication come in, and also for just territorial protection, but focused on technology, drone usage, all that stuff. And then the second one is territorial protection. So this is where indigenous environmental agents are formed, and they usually train them on what steps to take, like just every little thing of how to address invasion. So how to approach an invader, how to talk to them, what information to collect, how to not be intimidated, but also not intimidate the invader. So a lot of little things, and one of the most important ones is that they cannot enforce the police power. They are not policemen, and they can put themselves in danger if they go and act like they are. And so that one's very important as well. And the third one, indigenous people normally have their own associations. Each tribe kind of like a form of government or social organization, and NGOs help them to manage that association, do the paperwork, how to register it, do all the bureaucratic stuff that they're probably not familiar with. And then also they're getting to a point when they're helping them find their own donors, relate with donors, and manage their own projects, which is a really big step. And then the last one is more about social organization and understanding. So it can range from territorial management plans. I actually got to see one of the meetings for updating their territorial management plan, and it was very cool because it was a very democratic process. They were basically setting up their own form of government, who's accountable to who, how do we make it inclusive so it's women as well, and it was very, very cool. I think they even like specifically said, oh, we indigenous people can be very, what's the word for machista in English? Misogynist? Yeah, misogynist? Okay. Oh, yeah, yeah. And I found it very cool that they're already addressing all those needs through their social organization. But it also comes that understanding that they're developing, it comes not only like in a specific workshop for it, but throughout those processes, they're learning to see why territorial protection is needed. That's one of the main questions. So a lot of people mentioned that they can have all the resources, they can have paid staff to do the territorial protection for them, they can have everything. But if they don't understand why it's important, then it's pointless for them to have all that. So developing that understanding is a very, very crucial step of the process. And I recently came across the concept of capacity development. I don't know if many of you have heard of it, but it's basically, I really liked it because it's basically taking capacity building into a deeper level. So building on existing capacities, but also having a sustainable, a change that is sustained from within. So it's sustainable, and then it's also changing the mindsets and attitudes. So I really found that these steps that they're taking are already at this level of capacity development, which is better than capacity building, more empowering as well. And also that social understanding that I was talking about why the territory and protecting the territory is so important, often is associated with their culture. So these young indigenous people are like usually the ones going to the training sessions and becoming communicators and environmental agents, but they often have to have their roots back to their culture, and they do this through their interactions with the elder. So they normally hear stories from the elder. Not everyone is willing to listen, but the ones that are willing to listen talk about their culture, like the most valuable thing and like the thing that really gives them all the answers to why territorial protection is needed, and also to make them remember about what has been done in the past, what their ancestors did to protect the land, which is very important as well. And so this is the network of how they exchange knowledge. So this is the one I was referring to. And also indigenous people can exchange their knowledge with other communities, their learned experiences, and that improves territorial protection on a more large scale. Then in blue, we can see the different trainings that go on between government agencies, NGOs, and indigenous people. But there was also a case where they mentioned this organization or agency, ISMBio, mentioned that it was indigenous people who taught them how to use drones, which I found very cool because it challenges a lot of taboos that we have about indigenous people always receiving from the outside and not knowing how to use technology and that type of thing. So I found it very, very cool. The one in purple shows the planning, how they plan collaboratively. So a lot of the times it's indigenous people sharing what their needs are with NGOs and government agencies, and yeah, just overall planning together. Excuse me. And then in orange, we have the ones for protection. So often it's the leaders who bring any information about invasions into the community and trying to address it. And then if they create that complaint, that report, they can bring it out to FUNAI, or sometimes they do it through the NGO to get more help. And the last one is policy shaping. So the government agencies, NGOs usually work together to generate information to better inform policies. And Caninde is actually very well known for their activism. So they do a lot of protests and a lot of ways to influence the government. And this one is just kind of bringing everything together. So we see, one of the main things that I learned is that territorial protection is not an activity of its own. It acts with a lot of other activities together. And so here in the middle, this pyramid, it's from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you guys have seen it. So it basically goes from very basic physical needs to more like cultural and social needs. And then the highest one is like self-realization, which is the most complex need. And so we have a similar one from the information I gathered. And we can see at the base, we have territorial protection. So territorial protection is needed for each one of those needs to be met. But also, that one is dependent upon having a territory to protect in the first place, a recognized territory. But we can see that all of their activities, even when they go to territorial protection, they're really contributing to the protagonism of indigenous people. So this is really at the center of what they do. And as they do so, it continues to strengthen territorial protection, but it also allows them to start participating in the non-indigenous world, which is very crucial for them because they live in a non-indigenous, surrounding. but they face a lot of challenges as they do so. So the prejudice, the colonized vision and culture against indigenous people, and is often driven by economic interests, like I mentioned, and supported by policy. And policy is very important here because it often limits the activities of agencies, and it also limits the demarcation of the territory. And so going more into just my real analysis, stakeholder analysis is the first one. And one of the main things that I wanted to answer with this was how the stakeholders are able to collaborate so well, because we see in all of their activities, it involves a lot of collaboration in every step of the way. So I wanted to see what makes the stakeholders be able to collaborate so well. And here you see the whole stakeholder analysis. I've broken it into pieces so you can see a little better. But at the very top, what is seen on the outside is their level of personal involvement. So the level of commitment they have to the cause, which is very, very deep. They are often, I think almost everyone mentioned the personal threats they receive as a result of being involved in the cause, and they're willing to accept that because they're really that committed. It also takes a lot of work. Indigenous people are often leaders in several organizations while working for a government agency, while doing this, like a lot of positions. So it's a lot of burden. And it's the same for NGOs and government agencies, which are normally underpaid, but they're continuing to do that heavy work. And then at a deeper level is the philosophy with which they engage. So they're usually respect and value indigenous culture a lot. So the indigenous people who are doing this work, like I mentioned, they're willing to learn from the elder and take that into their work. But also the non-indigenous people are usually they know that that culture is at the center of everything, and they take it into account with everything. They're also willing to learn and to listen to one another. So sometimes indigenous people can be defensive with white people, and they have their reasons to, but that willingness to also learn that there can be good things that come from them is also good. And it goes both ways, right? Non-indigenous people have to listen to their needs and be able to understand them. And the last one is that they're all looking for that indigenous protagonism. They're all of their activities promote protagonism, and they don't see it as we're doing this activity and this activity will continue forever. They see it as we're doing this activity so that indigenous people can do it on their own eventually. So they're seeking that protagonism in everything that they do. And lastly, their motivations, I think, are really at the core of why they're able to collaborate so well, because I think a lot of it is really in common. And the main one is environmental protection. A few of the indigenous leaders I interviewed mentioned we want to protect the environment, not only for indigenous people, but for everyone. This is really important for everyone. So it's really cool. And non-indigenous partners, a lot of it is for environmental protection and also for the defense of indigenous people rights. And so here are the main challenges that I found that stakeholders face when being involved in this type of work. So the first one, I already mentioned, that political interests interfere with the work of government agencies. And this often leads to limited resources and staff, which makes their work a lot harder, a lot more burdensome. And also for NGOs, sometimes they depend on government funds, sometimes they're independent, but even then they have limited resources and staff. And then in the government, we also find that not everyone is really committed to the cause. So some people are just there they just wear the shirt, they work for the indigenous people agency, but they never see indigenous people, they never go out to the village. So it puts more burden on the people who are committed. And so there are also the risks that I mentioned. And lastly, I think it's indigenous people, because they are involved in all these processes, they work with NGOs and government agencies, so they face the same burdens, but also because anything that affects the territorial protection then affects their livelihood directly. So they face a lot of those consequences. And then I really like this quote, but Funai doesn't stop because indigenous people are Funai's greatest strength. And it's a good transition into the SOAR analysis. So you can see very clearly at the core of it is indigenous protagonism and autonomy, because that one was found in all four of the categories. So it's a strength because they're the ones driving the processes now. It's a result because they've been working on that development for many, many years through that capacity building, through that culture. It's an opportunity because as they take space or those political spaces, they're also opening up that dialogue and that space for more good things to happen for them. And an aspiration because they're still striving for that, still striving to achieve even more protagonism. And then another one that came up in all four of them is that knowledge exchange. is very clear as a strength because they're already doing that work collaboratively. It's also a result of their own work, opportunity for more learning to happen, and an aspiration to continue passing that knowledge to future generations and build good leaders. And then technology came in strengths, aspirations, and opportunities. And yeah, I think that one is pretty clear on how it's already a strength. They're still continuing to build on it, and it's an opportunity because it continues advancing, so it keeps bringing more opportunities to include that in their practices. And I think one of their major strengths is that collaboration and the people who are committed to the cause from all three groups. And the aspiration, I think the main one is for have everyone respecting the land, respecting indigenous rights, and just acknowledging them as a people. And then I also asked in my interviews, I asked them to give recommendations for other communities who face invasions, but a lot of different types of recommendations came up, even for other groups. So the first one is from indigenous to enforcement agencies to not remove their staff from strategic points when it's already working and helping address invasion, to just keep the work going. The second one is for the youth to not let their culture die, to even if you're involved in the non-indigenous culture, which is fine, to not let your own die and to continue to learn from the elder. And then the NGO staff gave an interesting one for conservation. It's really about incorporating social issues with conservation issues. And I think it's really against that talk about conservation away from people that was heard, I think, more often before, but still today. And then another one also for strengthening culture. And then another one promoting the exchange of knowledge amongst communities. So they don't want to be the ones telling communities what to do, and a white person coming in to tell indigenous people. They wanted to get to a point where it's indigenous people sharing their own knowledge as they see it from their own perspective with other people. And then from Punai to the government to sign the provisional measure to have environmental police working with them, and also to continue to strengthen Punai to provide resources and provide more benefits to their workers because they are doing important work. And then the last one is for indigenous communities to not confront criminals, to leave that to law enforcement agencies. Sometimes, they get desperate trying to wait for a response, so they do it on their own, but they're putting themselves at risk. So that is the last recommendation. And that is all. I thank God for the opportunity to see Brazil. It was a dream of mine since I was very little, so it was amazing to see that country. And I thank my committee for all their help with this from the beginning of this project. And the MDP and TCD programs have been amazing. I've learned so much, and everyone has been very, very helpful. And also the host organization, just letting me be there and see their work was a great opportunity. And everyone who agreed to collaborate with me, and just everyone who put up with my broken Portuguese, I think that was they helped me survive there. So yeah, I couldn't have done it without all this help. So thank you all. Thank you.